Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome Michael Lewis and Larry Wilmore back to our series. Michael is the best-selling author of several books and has appeared on our stage for two of them, Flash Boys with Malcolm Gladwell and The Undoing Project with Mindy Kaling. He also interviewed Walter Isaacson for his book on Leonardo da Vinci. Michael Lewis hosts the podcast Against the Rules. He's in conversation with Emmy Award winner Larry Wilmore, who has been a television producer, actor, comedian, and writer for more than 25 years. He is host of the podcast Larry Wilmore, Black on the Air. He previously interviewed Madeleine Albright, George Will, Jim Acosta, David Frum, Malcolm Gladwell, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Robert Reich at Live Talks Los Angeles. All of these interviews can be seen in our YouTube channel. In this episode, they discuss Michael's book, The Fifth Risk, Undoing Democracy. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special LA Live Talks, as Ted just mentioned, here from my very tidy office, very untidy office. And I'm so happy to be presenting this on behalf of LA Live Talks and my podcast, Black on the Air. And to welcome, I should say one of my regular guests at this point. I've talked to this guy. Of course, I'm a huge fan of his books. You all know him from Blind Side. All the way back to Liar's Poker, Big Short, all of that stuff. Michael Lewis, author of The Fifth Risk and other things. Michael, welcome to LA Live Talks.
Well, thank you, Larry. I feel like I'm with you.
And let's mention your podcast again, Michael, real quick before I know Ted mentioned it.
It's a podcast, it's a narrative podcast, and it's called Against the Rules. Right. And it's just started. The second season has just begun airing a few weeks ago.
Awesome. Michael, I love talking to you because you always have a way of looking at things like we've just gone through or finding stories that maybe, we may have overlooked and giving us deep insight on it, And it's weird because this last 6 months, and I hope to see the Michael Lewis book about these last 6 months. What has been your take on what's been going on lately? Do you have any reflection or anything? How are you doing, by the way?
No, sure. So, it's been a really interesting, I've been energized by it.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a book in it one way or another. I'm fiddling with it now.
Yeah.
I'll ramble a little bit.
Yeah.
So the first response I had to it was naturally an extension of The Fifth Risk. And it was, The Fifth Risk was all about how the presidency, the federal government that the president runs is a manager of a big portfolio of existential risks.
Yes,
exactly. And if you treat it with the hostility and the indifference and basically the incompetence that the Trump administration has, you exaggerate the dangers of all these risks. And the question was, when I wrote that book, I very explicitly framed it as, how's he going to kill me? What's the thing?
And it's been answered.
It's been answered, right? And so the first response, so this is the thing. Mm-hmm. That book looked at three parts of the government. It kind of picked for their obscurity: the Commerce Department, the Agriculture Department, and the Energy Department, to show that even in these places, you really should worry about how it's being managed, because if you don't, something really, really bad could happen. But on the cutting room floor, in a folder, there was a folder that said Center for Disease Control. And I thought, and it ended up not in the book. And it ended up not in the book because I thought, nah, it's too obvious. There's no way they'd neglect that. And I wrote it off because I just thought, no, everybody knows that's like a serious risk.
Right.
So the first response was what were they doing? And true to form, they mismanaged the apparatus that was designed to deal with this particular danger, this threat. Yeah. So the beginning of my pandemic was kind of thinking and looking at that and trying to understand why they had done what they'd done.
It really connects. It's funny because the way they handled it is exactly how you described how they've handled everything from the beginning. And it's weird because to go back in time and relive that, I was covering on my show at the time when they were supposed to come up with their transition teams, where they were at least supposed to begin the conversations. This is when there were still a lot of candidates, and you start from there in your book,
Right.
And just even from the beginning, just Trump's contempt for anything with any more intellectual heft than a bucket of KFC was just too much for him to handle.
And he said to Chris Christie, when Christie told him he needed a many hundreds of persons transition team to go and get the briefings from the civil service, when that he said, Chris, it's simple. We can take an hour break from the victory party and learn everything we need to know about the federal government.
After he won, you know.
And,
there was go ahead.
No, well, so it is. So it was. There was a kind of like playbook in how you respond to the Ebola virus, the Ebola outbreak, and how the Obama administration have responded to the swine flu outbreak. And these things were really important, and they never really bothered to receive the information. And it wasn't just Trump himself, right? It was, he fired everybody who might have done the job. So he sort of disabled the flow of understanding that might have reached him.
Did you ever find out on the people that you've talked to? I'm sure you must have talked to a lot of people, maybe off the record or on the record or whatever. I'm not sure how, when you're researching something like this, but people probably don't want to be known, But why would Trump, knowing that he doesn't have any experience, would get rid of the people who best qualified to make him look good? I mean, these people, Chris Christie would make him look good if he left Christie in charge,
You get different answers from different people. The closer you get to him, you like Steve, you talk to Steve Bannon.
Right.
He says he just doesn't care. What he says literally is he doesn't give a shit. He doesn't care. He's a barbarian, and there's a total indifference there.
Yeah.
I think it starts with that, but then I think there's something else going on. And this is probably more the job of a psychiatrist than my job. But I do think that if you were going when you're charged with something as grave as managing these risks that the lives of millions of people will turn on.
Right.
I think that it's it's easier to be dismissive of it all and to just say not my problem.
Right.
If you don't engage if you don't show up for the class, it's sort of easier to tell yourself in your mind the test isn't important if you never show up for the class in the first place. And it's sort of like knowledge has this price that when you learn even a little about something, if you let someone into your office who says, Mr. President, there's this infrastructure that we have to deal with a pandemic. It was flu, but pandemic disease that you probably should know something about. The minute you have that conversation, you're implicated. You got it in your head. You can't move through the world with a really simple worldview. You get confused.
It's like people who, when they don't go to the doctor, it means that they're okay.
Precisely. That's why. This is why.
As long as I don't go and I don't know that I'm sick, I'm okay. Yeah.
This is why you're you. So that's exactly right. So that's exactly right. It's that phenomenon.
Right.
And because what you can't do, it's such an interesting. Your question is so interesting because, so in the case of say,
it would make him. The thing is, he wants to look good more than anything else. We know that he's a narcissist, and it's almost like his narcissism just got a little too much where he not only wants to look good, he's got to take credit for everything too,
So he doesn't have the ability to rely on other people to make him look good. He doesn't, he's never really in his life marshaled experts to make him look. So that's not in his portfolio of talents. But this is a really curious case study because there are things that could have happened. He put the guy in charge of the National Weather Service who wanted to disable the National Weather Service because the guy owned AccuWeather, a private weather company.
Right.
And you could see situations like that where there was a motive, and the motive was narrow commercial interest, and narrow commercial interest got in the way of good government. But in this case, there's not like an obvious narrow commercial interest in a pandemic. It's I guess in some diabolical world, there's some pharmaceutical company that would really like a pandemic, but probably not. And so it really is a case where it is a pure expression of the desire for ignorance. And and that desire was fulfilled. So you asked me how that stage one of my pandemic was just marveling at how just in character the whole thing was, and in just adapting. It's been a very strange this business of adapting to this idea that other human beings are essentially agents of infection, and you shouldn't get too close to them. That's been a jarring adjustment for me.
And Trump's relationship, and this is what your book covers, for those areas that you said, but if we look at COVID, Trump's relationship to the non-truth and to conspiracy and everything other than the truth and science and that is fascinating to watch in real time, because he has these, when they were doing the briefings, he has those panel of experts who are in real time disagreeing with him on the stage in front of us. And he's talking about injecting
bleach. Yeah.
And acting like we're the stupid ones for not listening to him.
Well, there was a moment, and the moment may return. Just the mere fact that the experts are on stage with him is a good sign, right? It could have been even worse.
Not anymore.
No, right, that's true. But they're not doing those anymore because it made him look bad and his poll numbers were going down.
Yeah.
But the it's a funny situation for him, because the virus is, although it has obviously been politicized in some weird ways.
Sure, which is ridiculous, right?
Right. It's not a political question. The virus doesn't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
Right.
And it doesn't, and you can't spin it away. And you can't create some alternative reality where people don't die when they're infected. Now, you can create an alternative reality where you say they never die. That's really hard to do. That seems even beyond his powers.
Well, and it's like I was saying before, where he's saying the only reason why people are dying is because we're testing them. If we weren't testing them, we wouldn't know they were dying of COVID. So technically, they wouldn't be dying. It's our fault because we test so much, people are dying of COVID.
Yeah. And the truth is, we were only kind of getting up to speed on our testing, that we didn't actually even test that much in the beginning. I think he really was, in his own weird world. I can understand mental world why he was this way, hostile to testing, because testing, that is the only way you found positive cases. And
which he thinks makes him look bad.
Which he thinks makes him look bad, right? But the deaths you find even if you don't test, because they come to you. They come to you,
but only if you test do you know they died of COVID. That's right.
That's right. That's right.
Testing is the problem.
But I find it, our society is in a really curious state of mind, stage of development, all the rest, because we're supposed to be the leaders in this stuff.
Absolutely.
We have so much talent in science and medicine. We have so many resources. We have, and this is a technology and data problem too, that we are the leaders in data science. Yeah. And the idea that there's a virus that started halfway around the world, that we're now the leaders in dying from it, it's a kind of incredible situation. And so this is my sort of, I've kind of been looking at our country as this team of really talented players with a really shitty coach. It's sort of like it's like you took the best players from the NBA and you went to the Olympics and you didn't win a game. And it feels like that. It feels like a coaching, leadership, organizational debacle of a proportion that I couldn't have imagined.
No, and what's really troublesome to me too, I don't know if you talk about this in your book, I may have missed it, but he has the complicity of the state-run news, over at Fox, where, like, for instance, he's turned his role of leader to get us through this into a contest of blame right now. That's what he's turned it into, right? And he ordered the shutdown and everything, but he makes it seem like the governors who did it, and he's tried his best to tell them to open up and everything. And then Fox News plays the same game, saying these democratic states, these blue states that haven't opened up. It's like, people are fucking dying. Are you kidding me? You're going to make this about blame?
Yeah. It's so ugly, because what they've really done is push down the targets of it. They've redirected the anger that comes from having to shut down things in order to save lives at people in positions that aren't that powerful. I mean, like the local public health officers in this country, in my state, pretty blue state, they're getting death threats, because the way that the population sees it is, Trump says it's okay, but this public health officer says I can't go to church, or I can't go to a ball game.
He's the asshole.
Yeah, and so so he has completely abdicated the responsibility of creating an environment in which these people can do their jobs responsibly. Now, these people do understand their trade-offs too. It's not like they want to have a lockdown, but when, I mean, we saw it play out here in my neighborhood. The Alameda County, California public health officer said it wasn't safe for Tesla to open, and Elon Musk stands up and says, "I'm a move to Texas and close down my factory, and so if you don't let me open." Well, today the front page of the newspaper has Tesla workers are sick. Now, we don't know they got sick on the job. It's possible they didn't, but it's just, the health officers are trying to do their best, but they're in an environment where they could, Elon Musk had his way, and he had his way because at the top of the government, the President of the United States isn't giving these people any support. And so it's the local Alameda County health officer having to go toe to toe with Elon Musk rather than the White House.
Yes, they've been deserted by the person who should be leading them into battle, not pushing them into battle and say, where are you guys going? I didn't tell them to go there.
It really is like if we were invaded by Russia and the president said, "You guys got this. Call me if you need some supplies." But, it really is Montana needs to do better job of defending that border, and it's a problem. It's not a problem that's, in some ways, it's naturally localized, that you're gathering intelligence and responding to outbreaks at a local level.
Sure.
But without a centralized response, it's all folly. Because if, I don't know, the state of Louisiana manages itself very sensibly, but the states of Texas and Mississippi decide, everybody can play, then Louisiana, it was futile. The virus mushrooms in Mississippi and Texas, and Louisiana gets infected all over again. And on top of it, paid a price of doing the right thing and shutting stuff down. So it's just, it really requires it's a public good response. It's sort of like a problem of the commons. And the only way you deal with it is with central authority, and he has abdicated the responsibility.
And he's playing both sides with the racial tension after the George Floyd incident.
I do want to say one thing, and that is, I found when I was working on the book, the last thing I wanted to do was spend too much time just on Donald Trump.
Right.
And I tell you why, partly because he's a symptom, that it's not just Donald Trump that we put him in office. I mean, it was a minority of us, but nevertheless, we put him in office. And partly because it obscured the bigger problem. I mean, what should be happening is that when the president behaves this way, he should be run out of office. I mean, he should have been run out of there. He should have, that his poll numbers should show 15% support, not 39% support. And so there are other things that really interest me about this. One is the tolerance of the society for the mismanagement, and the second is, and this is the story that interests me the most, and it was the story that interested me the most in The Fifth Risk, the way people compensate for this psycho dad we have running the family. I mean, the way other pieces of the society have to pick up and sort of perform acts of heroism that should be unnecessary. The way a local public health officer has to endure death threats to do her job. But they're doing it. There actually are people who are trying to kind of pick up or do the job that the president in effect should be doing. And those people interest me a lot. But you're right. Everything you say about Trump seems really obvious to me. But if you can explain why it isn't obvious to many millions of Americans, I'd love to hear the explanation, because it does seem crazy what he's done.
I think the way people interpret things are just different. They see Trump as a warrior for this assault from the left that has been nonstop for the last 30 or 40 years, or maybe go back to Vietnam, and that he is their one defense against the left. And they see the left as a bullying mechanism of society, and he stands up to those bullies. And so they see his inappropriate behavior, like his tweets, they see it as standing up to the bully left. That's how they look at it. So they don't care about who he's picking on, his choice of words, or that type of thing. They feel that the culture, the conservative culture, or as they call it, American culture, is being destroyed by the left. And he is one person in there who can protect them. I think that's to me, the most direct reason that explains how otherwise you would think rational people, we're not talking about fringe.
Right.
Michael, we know there are rational people out there who just let these things go by. Yeah. And it's just.
So here's a follow-up question. Now that I think you kind of rightly are occupying the mind of the people who can tolerate it.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So the next question is, why is it in the interest of this bullying left to shut down their local economies? I live in Berkeley. Berkeley is famously a lefty city.
Yes. Yes.
But nobody here actually wants the little restaurants and businesses shut down. The pain is just unbelievable.
Yes.
It's heartbreaking to watch.
Their conspiracy theory is that is how the left can gain power, because their king had the economy humming, but if the left can shut it down and destroy it, they can blame it on him and get him out of it. So they think that the left is more interested in power than in people having jobs. I've heard people say this, by the way. I'm not making this up.
Because I've never actually met anybody who thinks that. I must be in the leftiest place in America. I haven't met anybody. I haven't met a soul who thinks, "Wow, we're going to get power from Donald Trump by shutting down our restaurants and our small."
I'm in San Francisco, Berkeley. Am I in the leftiest place?
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, here I'm a right winger, but you probably are. I am, but I haven't met anybody except heartbroken people that this has to happen in order to preserve public health.
Well, go ahead, Mike. I was going to say, Tucker Carlson every night on his show makes arguments like this, and his reach to people is huge. He has a huge audience, and he makes these types of arguments.
Yeah, I don't watch it. So
I'm just telling you where it comes from.
Yeah, so that's where it comes from. So, I don't get out much these days, so it's really nice to have you come in and bring a different point.
Yes, I'm sorry to deliver that. Okay, here's what I want to ask you though. Let's talk about the risks. Because you say the fifth risk. So, are there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 risks? Is there a top risk? When you talked about, one of the scariest things in your book was talking about that, when we developed the nuclear weapons and how the waste was put there. It makes you think, what were people even thinking then? And you talk about not protecting our citizens. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, I'll tell you where the best way to talk about this is where the book title comes from. The moment that I realized what I want to call this thing. I just started in on it, and the first chunk of it was about the Department of Energy. Yeah. And I picked the Department of Energy because Trump had appointed Rick Perry to run it. And Rick Perry, well, but it's even better than that, right? He was a presidential candidate who says he wants to get rid of this bloated federal bureaucracy, and there were 3 entire agencies he was going to get rid of, and he was going to name them, and he went kind of 1, 2, and he couldn't remember the third one. He couldn't remember the name of it, and the one he said later he couldn't remember the name of was the Department of Energy. Right. So he wants to get rid of it, can't remember the name of it, and now he's the head of it. And the minute he becomes the head of it, he finds out for the first time in his existence what it does. And what it is a massive, incredibly complicated physics project. Yeah. And the massive physics project does many, many things that are terrifying. Mm-hmm. But one of the things it does is it maintains the nuclear arsenal. Mm-hmm. So So he says, he does an about face at his confirmation hearings for preparedness. Says, I'm so sorry I said that. Now I understand. Now I've opened a book and someone has explained it right. So I thought I'll start there. Because I didn't know what it did. I can't pretend to have known what it did. So, but I call around in the Department of Energy, and I find there's this character called the Chief Risk Officer. He's now been booted out, but he's in his home in Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
His name is John McWilliams, and he says I can go see him. So I go to Quogue, Long Island, and sit down with him in his backyard, where he says he picks up his cell phone. And he says, just so you understand, the Chinese are listening. And I said, what do you mean the Chinese are listening? He says, anybody who's at where I was in the Department of Energy just assumes that everything that they say, the Chinese and the Russians are listening. And he says, okay, he says, I'm not going to talk about anything that's classified. And I said, okay, I'm here. I said, basically, I'm here from the Trump administration. I don't have a lot of time for you bozos, but give me the top 5 risks that you manage.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, okay. He later said, he sent me a list of 138 risks. He said there are 100, but he said, I'll give you the top 5. And he says, number 1, a nuclear bomb going off when it shouldn't. He says, we worry about it every day and it's become very close to happening. He said, number 2, attacks on the electrical grid. He says, that sounds like an inconvenience to you, but we repel attacks every day, often from, sinister foreign forces. And if you imagine what happens if, say, the power goes out in the whole northeastern corridor for 2 months, the death and misery that would cause is unbelievable. He says, Americans don't think about this, but we brought all this patchwork of utilities that we have in this country. We bring the executives of the biggest one into a they call it the SCIF, the secured little place where the Chinese can't hear, and show them what has happened in the American power grid just over the last few years. And he says they start to sweat. He said they can't believe how horrible it is, how risky it is. So he said that was number 2. He said number 3, and so you got to remember this is 3 years ago. He says, all those funny little missiles the North Koreans are firing into the ocean, and everybody laughs about how they don't know what they're doing. He said, well, actually, there's a team of Ukrainian scientists that moved to North Korea about a year ago. And they actually know what they're doing. And we can tell, our physicists can tell by the way those missiles are being launched and where they're going, that they're getting smarter and smarter and smarter.
Wow.
And so we're really worried about their ability to deliver a nuclear weapon to the American West Coast.
Right.
That's number 3. And he said number 4, he said some president coming in who doesn't understand the importance of the Iranian nuclear deal. Because that is going to prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. And if anybody who bails on that dramatically increases the odds they will. And if they do, we're talking about greater increase of risk of nuclear war in the Middle East. So he said that was 4. And then I said, well, what's the 5th? And he goes, let me think about that. And he thought, and he kind of was frozen. And I thought, all those other 4 risks, I'm worried about them too.
Yeah.
But if somebody's really thinking about them and worried about them, and it's top of mind, they're more likely to be managed. It's the things that are kind of out there that are in the back of your mind and you're not paying that much attention to. It seemed to me the ones that are scary. It's like the one that hasn't surfaced in a while. Mm-hmm. Like the hurricane hits New Orleans and everybody's ready for the next hurricane. Mm-hmm. But if the earthquake hits New Orleans, nobody knows what to do. Right. I said the 5th risk, I said, you've just given me basically the title of my book. And it's the risk that nobody is really thinking about, but that the federal government is actually responsible for managing. And then he said, well, I'll give you the 5th one. And he said, the 5th one I'm going to say is not sexy. He says, but it's program management. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I'll give you an example. He says, just in the Department of Energy, he says, we have one program that costs $3 billion a year. And it's in Eastern Washington, where 600 square miles have been fenced off. And it's the site where the plutonium was made for one of the atom bombs that was dropped on Japan. So it was this massive plutonium manufacturing facility that was thrown up in the early 1940s,
right.
mid 1940s, and just a breathtaking amount of chemical waste and plutonium waste. was leached into the soil. I mean, millions, actually hundreds of millions of gallons of the stuff. And it's now, it's underground, and it looks like a plume when you look at images of it. And it's heading slowly towards the Columbia River. And if it gets into the Columbia River, it poisons the water supply of the Pacific Northwest. And he says that is a program that has been not very well managed. And it's going to cost, done well, it's 100 years and $100 billion. And it's the sort of thing that we could just take our eye off the ball and you never know what's going to happen. So that's what got me into. But then it took him a while to think of that. I thought was interesting. But anyway,
yes, exactly.
The bigger point was, what was it that we didn't imagine was going to happen, and it happened, and it turned out to be this. But the truth was, I was being much too subtle, because I was thinking in terms of like, I was thinking, the most obvious risks, they will still be managed. It's where where the society's really not paying attention that we got to worry about. And it turned out we need to worry about all of them. Because a risk of a pandemic. I spent time with Obama. I wrote a big piece about Obama right before his second election, so early 2012. And I asked him what kept him up at night, and it was either one or two was pandemic. He says it's gonna happen. There are more and more of us. We're a natural host to a virus.
Because it happened in his first year with the SARS or whatever.
It happened with the swine flu. Swine flu, and then and also Ebola. And so
Ebola, right.
And actually, you don't think it happened during the Bush administration with the bird flu. And you go back in history, and this is always bubbling along. It's not like we're safe.
It didn't just appear. It's been going on for eons and eons.
And it's not, and specific steps had been taken to make sure we had a more effective response. And to me, there's one that's the biggest thing, and two the most interesting thing. The biggest thing was they put on the National Security Council in the White House a pandemic response director. Before, there had never been such a person. And the point of that was, you're overseeing all the agencies in the response. So you can say, if the Center for Disease Control says they have a test, you're a check on them. You can test it. So you can stop interagency fighting. You can coordinate things. And Trump fired that person. But the other thing they did, and this is the thing that, in a funny way, to me, is more distressing, because of the nature of our neglect as a society of our government and our hostility to our government. One of the big things our government does, and it's maybe the least sexy, but it is hugely important, is make lots of basic investment in science and research in science, science and technology, that is not going to pay off anytime soon. And it's why no corporation will make the investment.
Yeah, because they can't make money in the short term.
Right, that may pay off 50 years from now. So, cure for cancer. The solar energy, the whole solar energy industry starts that way. It's sort of like moonshot kind of stuff. And there was a moonshot kind of thing that Trump canceled. He just zeroed out, that had been going on for, I think, the better part of a decade, called Predict. And Predict was a $200 million a year program. It was setting out to do for viruses and disease what the National Weather Service has done for weather.
Wow.
So 50, 60 years ago, your weather forecast sucked. You have no idea how much better the weather forecast has gotten. You just take it for granted, right? You take it for granted. Yeah.
There's an episode of The Crown that dealt with that, when some horrible fog rolled in, and it was that period where, because of their air and everything, you couldn't tell if it was smoke or fog, and they were trying to predict the weather, and there was all these voodoo ways of predicting it, or witch doctor ways. It was so funny, and it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago, right? And now now we're pissed when the meteorologists miss the hurricane track by 10 miles. But we've just got that they've gotten better and better and better at a very complex task.
And you mentioned, let me say real quick, because I remember in your book, you said there was one point where someone predicted a tornado and they got it right, but that was the only chance they could get it right. And so rather than keep trying to do that, they said, let's not predict that anymore.
Well, so that's funny. This is the origin of the National Weather Service. That these two Army guys, and I think it was in the 40s, late 40s, it was after World War II, do predict this tornado down in Kansas. And they realized how lucky it had been, right. and they said, no, don't ask us to do this again. But never mind, they're going to ask to do it again. And it's in any case, it is a great triumph of government to have organized this weather prediction machine. And it isn't just the government. It's organizing also private sector research. It's not just a bunch of people in an office in Washington.
It's not someone drawing a Sharpie on a map saying it's going there.
No, that's something else.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting idea that you could do the same sort of thing with viruses by sampling animal populations around the world, seeing what viruses are in snakes, how they mutate, what's the likelihood it's going to jump into people, how it would jump into people, and you start to be able to predict what you might need, say, a vaccine for. Now, we're a long way away. We're like where the Weather Service might have been in the 1940s or 50s, but our tools are so much better. And just to have, it's $200 million a year. It's not a lot of money. And just to have eliminated the possibility of that research happening is so depressing to me, because, this seems like the worst pandemic in history, but it's not. And there is every possibility that one day there will be a virus that kills kids, that kills that kills 10% of the people who get it, that is even more transmissible. We're not setting ourselves up to deal with it. And it's that longer term thing that to me is so scary, and that Trump had absolutely no interest in, just none. It's just like, for him, that's a waste of money.
It's kind of like a cousin, I live in Southern California, you're in Northern California. We both have dealt with earthquakes. I've dealt with my entire life. It's kind of like earthquake study, they still can't predict earthquakes when it's like they can predict it when it's like, when it happened 30 seconds ago, I mean, your dog can predict it probably quicker than they can, but they keep studying it. And I think it's good because maybe there are patterns here, maybe the way that they, who knows,
here's what it is.
I wouldn't want to take away that money for the research,
No, smart people willing to take less money to engage in basic research to create new knowledge that will one day save us all seems like a really good investment. And it's not like these people these are, that was the thing. The only reason I ever wrote a book about this, as opposed to just a magazine article, is the people who do this work are quite moving characters.
Wow.
Because they see, you or I mean, maybe you could, but there's no way in a million years I could figure out better way to predict how viruses are going to jump.
No, I can't. I'm a comedy writer, for Christ's sake. What do you think?
My sixth grade teacher figured out I was not the person who was ever going to be that person. I was identified very early on as lacking in scientific aptitude, but those people who have that aptitude and who are willing to devote it to the greater good of the society, when they could be making quite a bit more money going in, trading derivatives on Wall Street or whatever, those people, those should be heroes.
God bless them. I agree.
And those people are not only not heroes, but in this current environment, kind of reviled, it's just perverse to me. It feels like the whole society's value systems are screwed up.
Yeah.
And the greatest insult is that when Trump gets up and talks about all these people being in the deep state.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
That's not what these people are. They're people who know things, and they're trying to make the country a stronger, better country.
Yeah, one of the biggest losses that an organization, I'll say organization, because rather than just speak of Trump as an individual, there's really a whole organization now between the complicitness of the media, the people that enable him, all these things, But this contempt for institutional knowledge, which is so important, this is not partisan knowledge or political knowledge, but institutional knowledge to know how things run, and for the people who have had jobs for 30 years, 20 years, those types of jobs, they're so important in society. The jobs that there are people that work at the White House who work through all the administrations, because they know where every light switch is, and this and that. You go in and you just fire all those people. Good luck.
Yeah. No, it's I don't know. It's disturbing. So I want to ask you, because you've been asking me questions. What's your pandemic?
Kind of what this format is.
Yeah, I know, but that's all right. What has this experience been like for you? It's been 6 months. It's been 3 months or 3.5 months. How are you coping with this new social life?
Well, part of it is tough. I mean, for being able to see family and that kind of stuff. My family is pretty close. We see each other regularly. I saw my niece and sister for the first time this past weekend, and it seemed like forever. It was so odd. And my niece gave me a hug. She said, "Is it okay if I hug you?" I said, "I don't have COVID. Do you have COVID?" She said, "I don't have COVID." "Well, give me a hug," And we hugged. She started crying and everything. And it was it just dawned on me how important our interactions are and just being close and everything, I'm basically here with my son. My daughter's with her mom, not too far away. For me as a writer, professionally, I'm very lucky because I can write. I don't have to be somewhere, as we're fortunate in that sense, but a lot of my colleagues have been out of work, and I've seen a lot of friends that I have that own small businesses. I have some friends who have restaurants, have been devastated, some of those people, and that's been really hard to be witness to, some of that stuff.
Has it affected your sleep, your emotions, all that other stuff?
I'm kind of a hermit by nature anyway. So, for me in that sense, the first 2 weeks I was a bit in a daze because you couldn't go anywhere and it was like Night of the Living Dead, But I'll talk about my son for a second. My son has Asperger's, it's high functioning autism. And so, we've always felt, I wouldn't say feel sorry for John, but he spends a lot of time by himself in his computer. He doesn't have a lot of friends and that kind of stuff. And for him, it's like, now everybody knows what my life is like. But I'm like, John, you're absolutely right. John's like, this is normal for me. What are you kidding? Oh, you're not going anywhere? Oh, no friends are coming over.
So my son is a 7th grader. He's going to be in 8th grade next year. And when they closed the schools down, and he came home after about 2 weeks, he started saying things like, "Is there any chance they'll never find a vaccine?" He says, "I really hope they never find it." He said, "No," because he's so happy. Sort of like, I don't have to go to school anymore. This is unbelievable.
Yeah, my daughter, unfortunately, fortunately, she was graduating from college this year, but couldn't have that graduation. And, it's such a shame, that rite of passage of having the family there and all that stuff. So that was very disappointing, but, she's adjusting. She's a champ, as I like to say, But, the biggest thing has been the last few weeks with the whole protesting and all that. That's been more surreal almost than the COVID thing, because it happened right on the heels of it. And for that to happen to society during a quarantine has been, me as an observer of human behavior, kind of like I said, is fascinating to me, of the things that are occurring. As I look at it, there's the other side of me too that comments on it as well, because I have a perspective in this. I've been reporting on this stuff for years,
Right. I think history will look back and marvel at where the society was on the issue of race while it had Donald Trump as president.
Yeah.
Because you can see that the society is moving in a direction. I mean, you can see, as Obama said, a much broader coalition of people are on the streets. Yeah. And it's almost speaking with one voice. I mean, even the NFL has gotten on board. I mean, that's the most amazing thing to me.
Mitt Romney was saying Black Lives Matter.
so it's not like things are not moving. They're moving. It's amazing they're moving with the leadership that we have.
But Michael, ironically, it may have taken that for this moment to happen.
You're right about that.
Because remember, Ferguson happened under Obama, and people were just as outraged, but that match went out pretty quickly, as you remember. It lasted for a little bit. I remember covering it at the time.
Right.
There weren't the same amount of allies and that kind of stuff. It was like they treated Obama like the racial janitor. Obama, you go clean that up. There's a mess over there in Ferguson.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it.
So this is a little different, because people have a different target.
Yeah, they have something to push off of.
Exactly. But ironically, the thing that's surprising me is that it's this global thing. It's not, it's not parochial. Which is kind of surprising. That has surprised me more than anything.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. So you find that it hasn't disrupted your life as a writer.
Not as a writer, but as a producer, yes, because we can't make things.
Right.
So, and performer to a certain extent, and I really miss that a lot. There's a, when you make shows and you do that kind of stuff, you create family in this business. Right. I still, some of my best friends are people who I worked with early on in the business who we always kept in contact with, and sometimes you work with those people for like a month, not really that long, but they become like family, and that part of the business I really miss a lot,
Yeah, we were in the middle of our podcast season production when this happened, and that is one form, unlike film, where you can kind of do it. There's some damage done, and it's harder to go out and physically report things, but you can still kind of eke out the stories if you have to do it. But anything that, all of Hollywood's been shut down.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me ask you this question. Do you think, when you see these protest groups asking for like big change, they're not just small change, but big change, it makes me wonder, I wonder if we're at a moment, and you may be better to answer this in a couple of years, like I said, when you do your book, I wonder if we're going to see big governmental change in a lot of different areas, not just in this area. Like, are we at a revolution point? It's hard to know. We're in the middle of history. Do you have any feelings about that or anything? Or?
I think what I think is that I was asked in November by someone who was interviewing me about the fifth risk what I thought it would take for there to be a revolution just in Americans' attitudes toward their own government and a resurgence of the ability of government to tackle big problems and be trusted in tackling big problems. And I said I thought it would take a pandemic. Now we have a pandemic. And now what I think is if the thing went away tomorrow, and that's not, it's highly unlikely, but it could mutate into a common cold. And if that is it, so let's just say that happened.
It is a coronavirus.
So let's say that happened, that it just ended right now. I don't know if the message has been delivered sufficiently strongly to people that this is what happens if you don't have a revolution in government, if you don't change the relationship of that enterprise to the society, and you start to address really critical problems that can be addressed. But let's take the other extreme. Right. Let's say that
what if Trump gets reelected?
And let's say that the virus that we start to essentially get the herd immunity numbers that people just get they're tired of being in isolation, that they rebel against any kind of control, and let's say that 1 million Americans die, which is not inconceivable. Then I think quite possibly yes. If Trump's reelected, I don't know. But if I was saying, if you get Biden in there, what kind of mandate will he have, and what kind of cooperation will he get from Congress when he says this whole enterprise needs to be reformed and it needs to be strengthened in places? In some cases it needs to be streamlined, but in other places it needs a lot more resources, and it needs to be strengthened. It needs to be run in a different way, and its relationship to the American people needs to change. And we need to start explaining to the American people why they need this thing. And they'll hear it now because they just watched 500,000 people die because it wasn't run properly. I think that's conceivable. Now, on issues of race, this is above my pay grade. I have no idea where we go there. This is not a problem the government just fixes. it's the big problem in American life, and it's so thorny. I would not care to venture how this plays out. But I like the reaction. I mean, what's going on in the streets now is heartening. It really does feel like an awakening. And and there are moments when I look at, I looked at I don't know if, what happens in the NFL is a really big deal, because unlike the NBA was already woke, right? But the NFL was really not, and the NFL really feels like a white Southern enterprise in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not just that, but it feels that way.
Sure.
White Southern and Midwestern, rural,
America.
But when Drew Brees, my quarterback, because I'm from New Orleans, stood up and tried to make this all about whether you were a patriot, and got just slapped every which way and backed off instantly.
Yeah. That
was a huge moment. It was a huge moment. And the sort of like, there's now a generally agreed upon unacceptability in what's going on. And there isn't another, and there's no change in the conversation. So God knows where that takes us, but it's kind of like it's very positive, I think.
We may have reached a certain tipping point in that. That is interesting, the Drew Brees thing, because you could just look at it as, Twitter mob or whatever, but you're right. It is a little more than that. I think he issued 3 apologies. And
yeah.
And he's obviously very sincere. I don't doubt his sincerity, but he never would have had to do that a few years ago.
No. And the way that all, if I had to guess what's going through his mind, it wasn't the Twitter mob. It was that some large number of his teammates.
Yeah.
Said,
definitely.
No, you don't do this.
Right.
And he heard him. And that the teammates felt emboldened to say it is a very good sign.
Yeah.
Because I think 15, 20 years ago, maybe not so much. Right. Maybe even 10 years ago, maybe even 5. Look, Colin Kaepernick got run out of the league. So it's without too much resistance. So I'm things. This is not a static, stable environment, and I'm not going to predict it. But I do think there is like a sequel to The Fifth Risk. That is a very hopeful book about what happens when America wakes up to the problems, the big problems in the society that can be addressed with leadership from the top. And I'm hopeful I write that book.
Yeah, me too. Let's hope so. Well, we have a couple of questions come in, Michael. I know we only have a limited amount of time with you. Appreciate you being here for everybody. You have so many fans out there. So, Ted, what are a couple of
so here's the first question. First question is, I keep trying to come up with a word that describes where we are, and I think reckoning does that. It's about what we haven't done, what we need to do, and what we have done. Would you agree with me? What word do you think describes where we are today?
It's like wake up call. Is that a word? Can I string it all together without the spaces?
Yeah. Okay.
Can we make that a one word, like a German word? Wake up call.
Alarm.
Wake up call. But it's that's what it feels like to me. And what you can't get away from is that 4% of the world's population, and we got 30% of the deaths. And we're supposed to be the best at this. Something's wrong, and it threatens everybody in some way or other. So it isn't like the hurricane that happened to some other people, or the earthquake happened to some other people. The whole country is implicated. The whole world's implicated, but the whole country is implicated, even rich people. And I think that is galvanizing. So we're paying a price. We are paying a price for the way we've lived our democracy. And now we have a chance for, we are going to need to be led. That we, leaders are going to have to stand up and speak to us about what's happened in a way that explains what happened, why it happened, and how we stop it from happening. This, and not just with disease, lots of other things. Inequality, inequality in a way is its own pandemic in this society. And it costs lots of lives and lots of happiness. and so these problems can be addressed, and it's just we need the leaders who will address them.
Two more questions. One here says, how do you think the pandemic will be written about in 3 to 5 years or in 10 years? I feel the way the story is told now is very much like a sporting game. It's really all about scores and stats.
So I don't feel that it's being told that way at all. I mean, it depends on who you know, right? My father knows 18 people who've died. So that's not so much scores and stats.
Sorry about that.
No, it's nobody. It's not I don't mean to play the victim. It's just, it's that I think it depends on where you sit in the middle of this.
Yeah.
And if you're sitting a long way away from people who are falling ill, then maybe that's the way you look at it. All right. I think the way I fear it will be told is, that this was a warm-up for a much graver disease, and that we either did or didn't respond by getting ourselves ready for that. That we should be not looking at this as the end of a story, like, oh, there were all these warnings this would happen and this happened, and then it all went away. We should be looking at this as a progression, and that this may be a fairly trivial event in relation to one we have to deal with in the future. And how we respond to this is going to drive our ability to respond to the one that occurs in the future. So I think that's the way I think it's going to be viewed. It is a moment in disease history where really a moment in disease history where we either figured it out or we didn't figure it out.
I mean, there's people get plague amnesia, you know.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's I don't think it's gonna be 100 years, before the next one. And I think there are too many of us on the planet, and this is a premonition, and there are things to do to get ourselves ready, and we should be doing it now. We should be learning real time how you manage this, where you need to empower people, teaching people who they should be trusting, like these public health people, we really need to trust them. And broadly, I think Americans have done a pretty good job. There've been, there are pictures of parties in the Ozarks and people going to the beach in California, but I think broadly there's been pretty good compliance. But it's very hard to show people the benefits of prevention. This is what leaders can do, is they can show, look, you should not be upset that we had to close things down to prevent this disease. You should be celebrating the fact that 2 million people didn't die. You should focus your attention that way. But it's a hard sell. But I think the story of this disease is going to be how we responded to it, and did we prepare for the next one.
And our final question, Michael, a gentleman says, the stock market is too often cited as a measure of how well the economy is doing. The president does this every day. I disagree. What is a better measure of how the economy is doing, and how did we fall into the thinking that the stock market is?
So I'm totally unprepared for this question. And there's a really good answer that if you gave me like 24 hours to call some smart people, I would give it to you. But it would be some measure that measured inequality. That's part of the measure, that measured growth in wages, that measured number of people in poverty, that what you really want is not some raw economic measure. What you want is some raw happiness measure, like some happiness index that would measure that would tell you how the economy is doing. So if you ask me, is there one good statistic that's out there? I don't think there actually is. GDP is not a great one. The stock market is not a great one. Unemployment numbers, up to a point, they're pretty good in telling you how the economy is doing, but only up to a point. So I'd say it's a place where we're stats deficient, because all the stats we have can be made can be used. They can generate the impression that the economy is doing very well, when in fact it's not doing all that well at all. So I don't have a simple answer. I don't have a simple answer.
There you go.
Sorry.
But even your non-simple answers are very interesting.
Not that interesting, but I do my best. Larry, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's always great talking to you. Be well in Alameda County, and we will be looking forward to that next book. Believe me, we will really be looking forward to it. But in the meantime, you can still get Fifth Risk. It's a great read, you guys. And as Michael said, to read about some of the people who are kind of invisible, but they're doing the hard work and doing those things. And some of those risks you talk about, I'm still a little scared. You know?
Don't leave your house and you're fine.
I know, exactly. Thanks, everybody, LA Live Talks, and thanks for being on Black on the Air as well, Michael. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again for joining us. Michael's book, The Fifth Risk, Undoing Democracy, is available wherever books are sold.